Big Shaq's mother walked into a luxury car dealership expecting respect, but instead she got dismissed, humiliated, and judged by the man in charge. What the dealership didn't know? She wasn't just any customer. She was Big Shaq's mom. And when Shaq found out, he didn't just get revenge, he flipped the entire system on its head. What started as an act of discrimination quickly turned into the most unexpected power shift the dealership had ever seen. But how did Shaq do it? And what happened to the man who disrespected his mother? You won't believe how this story ends. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. Regency Motors stood tall under the bright midday sun, its sleek glass windows reflecting the rows of pristine luxury vehicles lined up outside. The dealership was a symbol of status, catering to an elite clientele who expected first-class service. Inside, the showroom gleamed with polished floors and shimmering cars, the scent of expensive leather lingering in the air. Lucille O'Neill stepped through the entrance, her heels clicking softly against the tile. She was a woman of presence, graceful, composed, and effortlessly elegant. Dressed in a tailored beige pantsuit with delicate gold accents, she exuded quiet confidence. Her silver-streaked hair was styled to perfection, and a leather designer handbag hung on her arm. Though unassuming in her demeanor, she carried herself with a dignity that commanded respect. But not everyone saw it that way. From behind the front desk, a young receptionist barely looked up before offering a half-hearted, "Welcome to Regency Motors." Her tone lacked the warmth given to other customers who had walked in just minutes before. Lucille didn't let it faze her. She was here for one reason: to buy a car. She scanned the showroom, her eyes settling on a sleek, deep blue SUV in the center of the floor. It was exactly what she was looking for. Stepping forward, she let her fingertips brush lightly against the hood, appreciating the craftsmanship. Before she could take a closer look, a voice cut through the air. "Ma'am, can I help you?" Lucille turned to see a salesman, a younger man in a sharp navy suit, approaching with an overly practiced smile. She offered him a polite nod. "Yes, I'm interested in this model. I'd like to hear more about its features." The salesman hesitated for just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but Lucille caught it. A flicker of doubt in his eyes, as if he was questioning whether she was in the right place. Still, he composed himself quickly. "Of course," he said, his smile tightening. "But just so you know, this is one of our higher-end models. It's fully loaded with premium features. Maybe I can show you something a little more within range?" Lucille's expression remained neutral, but a sharp pang settled in her chest. She had heard this tone before, the one that assumed, without question, that she couldn't possibly belong here. Keeping her voice even, she responded, "I'd still like to hear about this one." The salesman opened his mouth to continue, but before he could, another voice interrupted. "Derek, what's going on here?" Lucille turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man striding toward them. His slicked-back salt-and-pepper hair and tailored gray suit made it clear. This was someone in charge. "Mr. Reynolds," the salesman Derek said quickly, stepping aside. "I was just about to go over the details of this model with—" Mark Reynolds barely spared him a glance before his eyes landed on Lucille. The polite but hollow smile he offered didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm Mark Reynolds, general manager here. And you are?" "Lucille O'Neill," she answered, offering her hand. He took it for a brief shake, but released it too quickly, as if afraid to hold on too long. His gaze flickered over her, assessing, not just her name, but her entire presence. The way she dressed, the way she carried herself. Then, ever so subtly, his expression shifted. A practiced businessman, he didn't outright sneer, but the faint condescension in his demeanor was impossible to miss. "Well, Mrs. O'Neill, welcome to Regency Motors," he said smoothly. "Are you looking for something today?" "Yes, actually. I'd like to discuss purchasing this SUV." Reynolds' eyebrows lifted slightly, but his smile remained fixed. "Ah, this one. Beautiful vehicle, top-of-the-line luxury, fully loaded. A bit on the premium side, though." He let out a small chuckle as if sharing an inside joke. Lucille didn't react. "I understand that. I'd like to talk numbers." Reynolds clasped his hands together. Of course. But before we get into that, perhaps I can show you a few other options? We have some excellent models with, let's say, more practical financing options. Lucille inhaled slowly, steadying herself. I don't need financing. Her voice was firm, but polite. Reynolds blinked. Oh, he said, recovering quickly. I see. Well, that's wonderful. But you know, even for cash buyers, it's always good to be realistic. We wouldn't want to overextend, would we? Lucille stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She wasn't new to this. She had lived a lifetime of moments like these, times when people assumed she didn't belong, that she wasn't enough, that she had to prove herself. But she had nothing to prove. She simply smiled, though there was no warmth behind it. Thank you for your concern, but I assure you, I know what I can afford. Reynolds hesitated. He had expected pushback, but there was something about the way she held herself that made him uneasy. Still, his ego wouldn't let him back down. With a slight shift in his stance, he exhaled a theatrical breath. Well, Mrs. O'Neill, the truth is, this particular model has been very popular. We're being selective about serious buyers. Lucille's fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her purse. And you don't consider me a serious buyer? Reynolds laughed, low and dismissive. I'm just saying, we typically cater to a very specific clientele. Silence stretched between them. Lucille glanced toward Derek, the younger salesman, who looked distinctly uncomfortable but said nothing. The receptionist at the desk avoided eye contact entirely. She knew how this would end. If she pushed, Reynolds would either continue to patronize her, or he would shift into full condescension, making it clear that she wasn't welcome. And so, she made a choice. She wouldn't waste another second of her dignity on this man. Lucille straightened her shoulders, tilting her chin slightly. I see, she said simply. Thank you for your time. She turned and walked toward the exit, her steps measured and deliberate. She refused to rush, to let them think she was embarrassed. Behind her, she heard Reynolds exhale, muttering something under his breath. A small chuckle followed. Lucille didn't react. She had nothing to prove to men like him. As she stepped outside, the sun hit her face, warm and unwavering. She paused for a moment, breathing it in. Then, she reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and pressed a number she knew by heart. The line rang twice before a familiar deep voice answered. Hey, Ma. What's up? Lucille smiled slightly, but there was a quiet steel beneath it. Oh, nothing much, baby, she said. Just had an interesting experience at a car dealership. Thought you'd want to hear about it. A pause. Then, Shaq's voice, lower now, sharper. Where are you? Lucille glanced up at the bold, gleaming Regency Motors sign in front of her. She exhaled. I'm still here. A quiet beat, then, I'm on my way. Lucille tucked her phone back into her purse. She turned and looked at the dealership one last time, her expression calm, unreadable. They had no idea what was coming. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the sprawling mansion, its pristine white walls gleaming against the endless blue sky. The front gates opened smoothly as Lucille O'Neill's car pulled up the driveway, the long path lined with neatly trimmed hedges and towering palm trees. Despite the grandeur of her son's home, Lucille had never seen it as anything more than a place filled with love, because that's what Shaq had always made it. She stepped out of the car, adjusting her elegant beige blazer before closing the door behind her. Before she could take another step, the massive front doors swung open, and there he was, Big Shaq himself, standing in the doorway, his presence as commanding as ever. Ma! Shaq's deep voice boomed as he grinned, his broad arms already open wide. You finally came to visit me instead of making me drive all the way to you. Lucille chuckled softly as her towering son wrapped her in a warm embrace, effortlessly lifting her off the ground for a moment before setting her down gently. His energy was infectious, his presence larger than life. Not just physically, but emotionally. You know I like my peace, Lucille teased. Not all of us need a house big enough to fit a basketball team. Shaq laughed, draping an arm around her shoulders as he led her inside. The moment they stepped into the grand foyer, the warmth of home replaced the coldness of the outside world. The walls were adorned with framed photos, memories of championships, family moments, and his mother's proudest smiles. "Come on, let's sit down," he said, leading her toward the sunlit living room. "I made some fresh lemonade. You know, I'm trying to stay healthy." Lucille smirked, settling onto the plush sofa. "You? Staying away from junk food? Now that's a first." Shaq grinned, pouring them both a glass. He was always like this around her. Lighthearted, playful, full of jokes. He had always been her big, goofy son, despite the world seeing him as a giant. But today, something inside Lucille felt heavier, an unease that settled deep in her bones. Shaq noticed immediately. "Ma," he said, leaning forward, his voice dropping slightly. "What's wrong?" Lucille hesitated for a second. She hadn't wanted to bring this negativity into his home, into his peace. But as she looked at her son, the man she raised to stand tall, to protect, to never back down, she knew she couldn't stay silent. "So," she told him. Every word, every detail. The way the dealership staff had looked at her. The way that man, Mark Reynolds, had spoken to her like she didn't belong. How he had dismissed her, humiliated her, treated her like she was nothing. She hadn't expected it to hurt as much as it did. But saying it out loud felt like reopening an old wound she had learned to live with. As she spoke, Shaq's entire demeanor shifted. The easygoing smile vanished. The twinkle in his eyes dimmed. His broad shoulders tensed, his usually relaxed posture now rigid. And when she finished, the silence that followed was almost deafening. Shaq didn't speak. He didn't move. He just sat there, staring at nothing, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his face twitched. Lucille reached for his hand. "Baby?" Still, he said nothing. But his silence was louder than any outburst could have been. From the kitchen, soft footsteps approached, and then Shawnee Henderson, Shaq's wife, appeared in the doorway. Her sharp eyes immediately took in the scene. The tension in her husband's face, the way his fingers were tightening around the glass in his hand, as if holding back an explosion. "What's going on?" Shawnee asked, walking over. Lucille glanced at her son before sighing. "I told him about what happened at the dealership." Shawnee's brows furrowed. "The dealership?" Then, understanding flickered in her eyes. She turned to Shaq, who was still deathly silent. She had seen him angry before. She had seen him frustrated, annoyed, even furious. But this was different. This was calculated rage. "Shaq," Shawnee said carefully, placing a hand on his arm. Nothing. He was still lost in his own thoughts, his grip tightening around the glass until, crack. The sound was small, but it cut through the silence like a gunshot. Lucille and Shawnee both looked down. The lemonade glass in his hand had cracked under the pressure of his grip, the tiniest fracture running along its surface. He hadn't even noticed. Shaq finally inhaled deeply, setting the glass down before standing up. He walked to the window, staring outside at nothing in particular. Then, he was no longer in that room. He was 10 years old. Small compared to who he would become, but still taller than most kids his age. He had been walking home from school with his mother, hand in hand, when a man deliberately bumped into her, causing her to stumble. Shaq had turned, ready to push back to fight, but before he could, his mother had stopped him with a look. "Not like this," she had said softly, holding his hand tighter. He hadn't understood then. Why not? Why couldn't he defend her? Why did she let people like that walk away? Later that night, Lucille had sat him down, looking him straight in the eyes. "People like us," she had said. "They will always try to make us feel small. But you, my son, will never be small. Not because of your size, but because of your heart. And the way you handle these moments, that will define the kind of man you become." Shaq had carried that lesson with him ever since. But now, standing here as a grown man, as a son whose mother had just been humiliated, that lesson felt harder to hold on to. Shaq exhaled slowly, pulling himself back into the moment. Lucille was watching him, waiting. Shawnee stood beside her, concern evident in her eyes. Then finally, Shaq turned around. And he wasn't just mad, he was determined. He wasn't going to yell. He wasn't going to threaten. He was going to teach that man a lesson he would never forget. a lesson more powerful than any punch. He turned to his mother, his voice calm but firm. "Where exactly is this dealership?" Lucille's lips parted slightly. She could see it now, the plan forming behind his eyes. She hesitated for a second before answering. "Regency Motors." Downtown Shaq nodded, reaching for his phone. Shawnee's arms crossed. "What are you going to do?" He gave his wife a small smile, but there was something unreadable behind it. "Nothing crazy." Lucille narrowed her eyes. "Shaquille." "Ma," he said, pressing a number on his phone. "Trust me." She sighed. She did trust him, but she also knew her son better than anyone. And whatever was about to happen next, Mark Reynolds wasn't ready for it. Not at all. Shaq had been up early, working through his usual training routine, bench presses, squats, and a few rounds of free throws on the full-size court inside his mansion. But his mind wasn't on basketball today. It was on her. His mother's voice from the night before echoed in his head. The casual way she had told him about her experience at Regency Motors, the slight pause in her voice when she mentioned how they had dismissed her. She hadn't said it outright, but Shaq knew. She had been hurt. And that didn't sit right with him. Lucille O'Neill wasn't just any woman. She was the strongest, most resilient person he knew. She had raised him with discipline, love, and the constant reminder that dignity wasn't given. It was claimed. For someone to disrespect her like that, to make her feel less than, that was a mistake. Shaq wasn't one to act on impulse. His anger was controlled, strategic. He could have walked into that dealership last night and demanded an apology. He could have called their corporate office and had someone fired with a single phone call. But that wasn't enough. Shaq didn't just want an apology. He wanted a lesson, one Mark Reynolds would never forget. Shaq sat down in his home office, his massive frame dwarfing the leather chair beneath him. He pulled out his phone, then paused for a moment, thinking. If he called as himself, the dealership would roll out the red carpet, desperate to cater to a high-profile celebrity. No, he needed to be someone else. He cleared his throat, dropped his voice to a smoother, less recognizable tone, and dialed Regency Motors. The line rang twice before a peppy voice answered. "Regency Motors, this is Lisa speaking. How can I assist you today?" Shaq smiled to himself. "Game on." "Yeah, hey," he said, lowering his voice just slightly. "I was wondering if y'all got any of those high-end SUVs in stock. Something top of the line. I'm looking to buy today." The excitement in Lisa's voice was immediate. "Oh, absolutely. We have a fantastic selection of premium SUVs. I can set up an appointment with one of our managers to go over financing options." "Nah," Shaq interrupted smoothly. "I'll be paying cash." Silence. A small pause before Lisa recovered. "Oh, well, in that case, let me connect you to our general manager, Mr. Reynolds. One moment." Shaq leaned back, waiting. Right on cue. A few seconds later, a deeper voice came on the line. Oily, self-assured, the voice of a man who thought he knew exactly who he was dealing with. "Good morning. This is Mark Reynolds. I hear you're in the market for something special today." Shaq kept his tone casual. "Yeah, looking for something big, luxury, no budget. You got anything in stock?" Mark's enthusiasm practically oozed through the phone. "We have some excellent options for a buyer like yourself. When can you come in? I'd love to personally assist you." Shaq glanced at the time. 10:23 a.m. "I can be there in an hour." Mark chuckled. "Perfect. Ask for me when you get here." "Oh, I will," Shaq said, smirking. He ended the call and exhaled slowly. Now, it was time to play. An hour later, Shaq pulled up to Regency Motors in a modest black SUV. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed wealth. Dressed in a simple gray hoodie, loose jeans, sneakers, and a black baseball cap, he looked like any regular guy off the street. The only thing he couldn't hide was his size. Still, he kept his posture relaxed, unassuming. If they were going to judge him, he wanted it to be on appearance alone. As soon as he stepped inside, the showroom felt different. Unlike his mother's visit, where she had been greeted with skepticism, Shaq was immediately approached by two salesmen, eager to impress. But before they could even speak, a voice cut through the air. "There he is! My guy!" Mark Reynolds strode across the showroom with the confidence of a man who thought he was about to seal the deal of the year. His fake smile stretched wide as he extended his hand. Shaq took it, gripping firmly but without emotion. "Mark Reynolds," the manager said, eyeing him up and down. "Glad you could make it. I understand you're looking for something premium." Shaq nodded. "Yeah, top of the line. No budget." Mark grinned. "That's what I love to hear." Without hesitation, he led Shaq across the showroom, talking a mile a minute. He rattled off premium features, custom leather interiors, and high-tech upgrades, each sentence dripping with enthusiasm. Shaq let him talk. He let him think he was in control. They stopped in front of a sleek black luxury SUV. "This right here is the crown jewel of our collection," Mark said, patting the hood proudly. "Perfect for a guy like you. Powerful, stylish, and of course exclusive." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Exclusive, huh?" Mark chuckled. "We don't sell these to just anybody." Shaq tilted his head. "Funny. You said the same thing to a woman yesterday." Mark's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before recovering. I'm sorry?" Shaq kept his face neutral. "Older woman. Classy. Walked in, wanted to buy an SUV. You told her it was out of her range. Ring any bells?" Mark blinked. His confidence wavered slightly, but he wasn't panicked. "Not yet. I speak with a lot of customers," he said smoothly. "I can't recall every interaction." Shaq exhaled slowly, pulling out his phone. "Well, lucky for you, I can." He tapped the screen and suddenly a recording started playing. Mark's own voice filled the air. "We're being selective about serious buyers. We typically cater to a very specific clientele." Shaq watched as the blood drained from Mark's face. The other employees had stopped moving. The entire showroom had gone quiet. Shaq let the silence linger before he finally removed his sunglasses, lifting his head slightly. And then, in his real voice, deep, unmistakable, and powerful, he spoke. "Oh, by the way, that woman was my mother." Mark's entire body stiffened. His mouth opened, then closed. He suddenly looked very, very small. Shaq took a slow step forward, towering over him now, no longer playing along. "What was it about her that made you decide she wasn't the right clientele?" I didn't." Shaq's expression didn't change. "Because when I walked in, you rolled out the red carpet. But my mother? The woman who raised me, the woman who taught me everything I know, she wasn't good enough?" Mark was visibly sweating. The silence in the showroom was suffocating. Employees exchanged nervous glances. A couple of customers had even pulled out their phones, recording. Shaq's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. "See, Mark, I could have come in here last night and bought out this whole dealership on the spot. But I didn't, because I wanted to see something." He folded his arms across his chest, his gaze locked onto Mark. "And you showed me exactly what I expected." Mark opened his mouth to defend himself, but Shaq wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a business card, and handed it to the now pale manager. Mark stared down at it. His hands were shaking. Shaq leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just low enough for only Mark to hear. "I own a few businesses, Mark. One of them, a dealership chain. And guess what? I'm in the market to buy another one." Mark's face went white. Shaq stepped back, putting his sunglasses back on. "See you soon." And with that, he walked out, leaving the entire showroom in stunned silence. The silence inside Regency Motors was deafening. The hum of the showroom's air conditioning, the distant ringing of a phone at the receptionist's desk. Every small sound seemed to magnify in the uneasy stillness that followed Shaquille O'Neal's words. Mark Reynolds, who just seconds ago had been confidently selling a high-end SUV, stood frozen. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a growing realization that made the color drain from his face. The employees nearby exchanged nervous glances. The receptionist, who had barely looked at Lucille the day before, now stared wide-eyed at Shaq, her fingers hovering over her keyboard as if afraid to move. A young salesman standing by the luxury sedans inhaled sharply, his phone gripped tightly in his hand, as if debating whether to record the moment. Shaq, towering and composed, didn't move. He simply let the weight of his words settle in. Mark's mouth opened slightly, then closed, He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Shaq tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Something wrong, Mark? His tone was smooth, controlled, almost amused. Mark blinked rapidly, forcing a weak chuckle. I think there's been some misunderstanding, he stammered. Shaq raised an eyebrow, his voice still calm. Oh? What part did you misunderstand? Mark fumbled for words, his arrogance slipping. Look, Mr. O'Neill, I didn't realize. Shaq held up a hand, cutting him off effortlessly. That she was my mother? Yeah, I figured. Another round of silence, a shift in energy. Mark was sweating now. The confidence, the superiority that had dripped from his voice just minutes ago had evaporated like steam. He had spent his entire career reading customers, deciding in a glance who was worth his time and who wasn't. But never had he made a mistake this big. Shaq let the pause stretch just long enough for Mark to squirm. Then, he slowly stepped closer. So, Mark? Shaq's voice was measured, deliberate, unshakable. He took off his sunglasses, revealing his deep-set, knowing eyes. Do I look like someone who can afford your cars now? Mark let out a nervous laugh, but it fell flat. Of course, Mr. O'Neill. That's never been in question. Oh, it wasn't. Shaq cut in, his tone still eerily calm. Because when my mother walked in yesterday, you sure seemed to question whether she belonged here. The employees watching shifted uncomfortably. Derek, the younger salesman who had witnessed it all the day before, lowered his head slightly, his hands clasped in front of him as if waiting for the storm to pass. Mark, scrambling for control, forced a chuckle again. Listen, this is all a misunderstanding. I treat all my customers with the utmost respect. Shaq's eyes narrowed slightly. Do you? Mark nodded quickly, trying to reclaim the narrative. Absolutely. We value every client, and I would never intentionally. Shaq pulled out his phone. With a single tap, a voice filled the air. Mark's voice. We're being selective about serious buyers. We typically cater to a very specific clientele. The color in Mark's face vanished completely. His own words echoed back at him, damning in their clarity. Shaq didn't look away. He simply held the phone up, letting the words hang like a noose. Mark's lips parted, but no sound came out. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides. He was exposed, caught in the very bias he had always gotten away with. The employees around them weren't just watching now. They were witnessing something monumental. The young receptionist covered her mouth, her eyes darting between Shaq and her boss. A salesman near the reception desk subtly pulled out his phone, recording. Mark finally snapped out of his daze. He took a shaky breath, switching tactics. Mr. O'Neill, I deeply apologize if there was any miscommunication. That's not what I meant at all. Shaq studied him, letting him squirm. Then what did you mean? Mark's lips pressed into a tight, thin line. Shaq leaned in slightly, his towering frame making Mark seem even smaller. Because let's be real, Mark. If my mother had walked in here dressed a little flashier, wearing a brand name you recognized, maybe dripping in jewelry, you would have treated her differently. But because she was just a well-dressed older black woman who didn't look the part, you didn't just assume she wasn't serious. You treated her like she didn't belong. Mark had nothing to say. Shaq let out a slow breath and shook his head, his expression disgusted but controlled. See, that's the thing about people like you, Mark. You think you can get away with this stuff. You think you can make people feel small just because you're standing on the other side of the desk. The room was dead silent now. Mark's composure had cracked completely. His face was red, his hands clasped together as if trying to physically hold on to his slipping power. Shaq exhaled, his tone shifting slightly. You know, I didn't come here looking to embarrass you. I came to see if you'd do exactly what I expected. Mark flinched slightly at that. Shaq tilted his head. And you did. A ripple of whispers moved through the employees. Some of them looked at Mark now, not with loyalty but with doubt. Mark knew it too. He could feel it. So he tried one last time to salvage himself. Mr. O'Neill, I would be honored to personally help you with any vehicle you'd like. Let me make this right. His voice was careful now, cautious, like a man desperately trying to keep from drowning. Shaq's laugh was soft, but it wasn't kind. Oh, now you want to help? Now that you know who I am? He gestured around the showroom. Where was all this hospitality when my mother walked in here? Mark had no answer. Shaq inhaled deeply, looking around at the employees. Some of them shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, knowing they had stayed silent yesterday, knowing they had been complicit. Then Shaq turned back to Mark and smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a knowing one. A dangerous one. Tell you what, Mark, Shaq said casually. How about I take you up on that offer, but not for a car? Mark frowned, uncertain now. Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. A completely different kind of silence fell over the showroom now. One of confusion. Suspense. Mark hesitated, then slowly took the card and read it. His eyes widened. His throat visibly bobbed. He looked up at Shaq, utterly speechless. Shaq smiled again, calm, unshaken, completely in control. See, Mark, I own a few businesses. One of them? He took a slow step closer, lowering his voice just enough for Mark to hear, but the weight behind it was seismic. I'm in the market for a dealership. Mark stiffened, completely. His fingers gripped the card too tightly, his entire world suddenly unraveling. And Shaq just let it sit there, watching as the arrogant man who had dismissed his mother just 24 hours ago now realized exactly who he had been talking down to. The power shift was absolute. And Mark Reynolds? He had just lost everything. Mark Reynolds felt like the ground beneath him had disappeared. He had spent years mastering the art of control, dictating conversations, and manipulating situations to his advantage. But now, standing before Shaquille O'Neal, he was completely powerless. His face was flushed, his breathing uneven, and a nervous sheen of sweat had formed at his temples. Mr. O'Neal, listen, Mark stammered, forcing a weak chuckle. This is a huge misunderstanding. I had no idea that woman was your mother. Shaq's expression didn't change. His towering frame remained still, arms crossed over his broad chest. His gaze locked onto Mark like a predator watching its prey squirm. So, let me get this straight, Shaq said, his voice slow, deliberate. You're saying if you had known she was my mother, you would have treated her differently? Mark froze, the weight of the question pressing down on him like an anvil. Well, no, that's not what I meant, he stuttered. I always treat my customers with... Shaq's deep laugh cut through the air, low and unimpressed. You sure about that, Mark? The young salesman, Derek, shifted uncomfortably, stealing nervous glances at the gathering crowd. Other employees stood frozen behind their desks, uncertain whether to intervene or stay quiet. Shaq's sharp eyes flickered to them. All of y'all were here yesterday, weren't you? He asked, scanning their faces. You heard how he spoke to my mother. No one answered. A few glanced away, others fidgeted awkwardly, avoiding his gaze. Shaq nodded, his expression tightening. Yeah, that's what I thought. The quiet murmurs in the showroom had grown into a low hum of interest. Customers who had been browsing cars or sitting in the waiting area were now paying full attention. A young woman near the finance desk pulled out her phone and started recording, while a man near the front entrance leaned against a display vehicle, arms crossed, watching intently. Shaq took a slow step back, his voice carrying across the showroom. Let me tell y'all something about what happened here yesterday, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. My mother, Lucille O'Neal, walked in here, dressed like the queen she is, looking to buy a car, cash, no financing, no games. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the luxury SUV Mark had tried to sell him minutes earlier. She liked this one, thought it would be a good fit for her. He looked back at Mark. But my guy here, he took one look at her, made a little assumption, and decided she wasn't the right clientele. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A middle-aged couple near the waiting area exchanged glances, and a man in a tailored suit furrowed his brow. Several people in the crowd began shaking their heads. Shaq wasn't done. So tell me, Mark, Shaq continued, his voice calm but unrelenting. What exactly made my mother not the right clientele? Was it the way she looked? The way she dressed? Or was it just the fact that you didn't think a black woman her age could walk in here and drop cash on a luxury SUV? Mark opened his mouth to respond, but Shaq didn't give him the chance. See, here's the problem with people like you, Shaq said, stepping forward slightly. You don't even realize you're doing it half the time. It's instinct for you. You take one look at someone who doesn't fit into your little box of serious buyers, and you shut them out. A hush had settled over the showroom. Employees who had stayed silent now looked visibly uncomfortable. Some were shifting in place, others were exchanging uneasy looks, as if reevaluating their own actions. Mark was drowning. He could feel it, his control over the room slipping like sand through his fingers. Mr. O'Neill, Mark interjected quickly, his voice slightly breathless. I deeply regret how your mother was treated. It was never my intention to offend or discriminate in any way. Shaq's eyebrow lifted. You regret it? He gestured toward the showroom floor. Or do you just regret that I showed up today and called you out? Mark hesitated. That single second of hesitation was enough. Shaq turned back to the customers in the dealership. See, folks, this is how it happens every time. Every single time. When it's just regular people, when it's you, they don't care. They treat you however they want. But the second a little heat gets put on them, the second a camera comes out, now they want to apologize. A few heads in the crowd nodded in agreement. A man near the entrance let out a low, like he had seen this play out before. Shaq wasn't done. You know what, Mark? Shaq said, his voice casual. Let's talk about Regency Motors for a second. Tell me something. How many minority employees work here? Mark's face visibly tensed. Shaq turned slightly, scanning the employees. Most of them were white men in pressed suits, a handful of women, but very few people of color. Mark hesitated before responding. We hire the most qualified candidates, Mr. O'Neill. Shaq nodded. Interesting. And in the last 5 years, how many black employees have you promoted to management? Mark's lips pressed into a thin line. Shaq's voice lowered just slightly. I'll wait. A few gasps rippled through the watching crowd. The silence stretched unbearably long. Mark, floundering, cleared his throat. We don't hire based on race, we hire based on... Shaq let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. Yeah, that's what they always say. Mark was losing more than just the argument. He was losing the room. Some customers who had been ready to buy cars were now walking toward the doors, clearly uncomfortable giving their business to a dealership that had just been publicly exposed for racial bias. Shaq let the moment sink in. He had played professional basketball for years. He knew how to control the clock, how to let time work in his favor. Mark Reynolds? He was running out of it. Shaq exhaled and let his stance relax slightly. You know, Mark, I'm not here to ruin your career. He let that sit for a second. I don't need to. You did that all by yourself. Mark flinched. But here's what's gonna happen, Shaq continued. You're gonna apologize to my mother, publicly. You're gonna make it clear that what happened yesterday was wrong. And then, you're gonna take a long, hard look at how you run this place. Mark opened his mouth to argue, but Shaq wasn't finished. If you don't? Shaq lifted his phone again, shaking it lightly. This video, it goes everywhere, and I promise you, Mark, you will not like what happens next. Mark visibly deflated. His shoulders sagged, his throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. He knew he was trapped. The crowd watched, waiting for his next move, and finally, with no way out, Mark nodded. I'll do it. His voice was barely above a whisper. Shaq smiled slightly. Game, set, match. As Shaq turned and walked away, the energy in the dealership had shifted completely. Customers whispered among themselves, a few recording on their phones, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Shaq pulled out his phone and typed a quick text to his mother. Handled it. Lucille's response came seconds later. I never doubted you, baby. Shaq slid his phone back into his pocket, exhaling slowly as he stepped outside. This wasn't just about his mother. It was about all the people before her who had walked into places like Regency Motors and been treated as less than. And after today, that would never happen again. Shaq stood firm, his presence alone commanding every pair of eyes in the room. He was no longer just a customer. He was the reckoning that Mark Reynolds never saw coming. Mark, once so full of arrogance, now stood frozen, his mouth slightly open as if still trying to process the moment. Sweat beaded at his temples, and his suit, which once exuded power and authority, now felt too tight, too suffocating. Shaq slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and without a word, tapped the screen. The showroom was suddenly filled with Mark's own voice, but now it was public. We're being selective about serious buyers. We typically cater to a very specific clientele. Maybe something more within your budget. The playback was crystal clear, each syllable laced with condescension, each word exposing exactly who Mark was behind closed doors. A gasp rippled through the room. Employees who had stayed silent earlier now shifted uncomfortably. A few lowered their heads, suddenly ashamed to be associated with the man now unraveling before them. A middle-aged couple who had been browsing near the front of the showroom paused mid-conversation, their eyes locked onto Mark with newfound disgust. A young woman in the back, who had been filling out paperwork, subtly pulled out her phone, angling it toward the scene. And Mark was crumbling. His hand shot up, shaking slightly as he attempted to cut Shaq off. That's not fair. That's taken out of context." Shaq simply raised an eyebrow. "Context?" His deep voice rolled through the room, low and unimpressed. He turned slightly, addressing the employees standing off to the side. "Anyone here want to give this man some context? Maybe one of you can explain why my mother wasn't treated like a serious buyer?" No one moved. No one spoke. Mark was alone now. The once powerful dealership manager, the man who held authority over every sale, now stood exposed in front of his staff, his customers, and his own twisted words. Shaq let the silence stretch. Then slowly, he shook his head. "You know, Mark, it's funny how quick people like you are to act like it's just miscommunication when you get caught." Mark opened his mouth to protest, but Shaq wasn't done. Shaq took a slow step forward, his sheer size making Mark shrink back instinctively. "So tell me," Shaq continued, his voice casual, almost conversational. "When my mother walked in here, dressed nice, polite, ready to pay in full, what exactly made you decide she wasn't worth your time?" Mark's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. It's not like that, Mr. O'Neill. I have to assess each customer based on what?" Shaq cut in. "How much they look like they belong here," Mark stammered, but the shame on his face said everything. Shaq let out a breath, then looked around the showroom, addressing everyone. "I want to know something," he said, his voice carrying through the space. "How many people here think this is the first time Mark's pulled something like this?" Silence. Then, a shift. A young salesman near the finance office spoke first, hesitant at first but growing bolder. "It's not." Mark whipped around, eyes wide. Ethan, another employee, an older woman who had been working reception for over a decade, nodded grimly. "We've lost customers before," she admitted quietly, "because of how they were treated." Shaq stayed quiet, watching as one by one, the people under Mark's rule started speaking up. A mechanic near the service bay muttered, "I've seen him tell sales reps to steer certain people toward used cars instead of new ones." A young woman in a company polo spoke up next. "He told me to ignore a customer once, said she was probably wasting our time." Shaq nodded, taking it all in. The dealership employees weren't just following Mark's lead anymore. They were turning against him. And Mark knew it. Mark's panic boiled over. "You all want to turn on me now?" he snapped, his composure finally shattering. "Like I haven't been the one running this place? Like I haven't made this dealership what it is?" Shaq just chuckled. "Made it what it is, huh?" He gestured around the showroom, where customers were now actively recording. The story was spreading before Mark's very eyes. Mark's breath was uneven now, his confidence shattered. "Look, I made a mistake, okay? Shaq raised a hand. "Nah, you didn't make a mistake. You made a choice." Mark froze. Shaq took a slow step forward, towering over the man who had once dismissed his mother without a second thought. "You made a choice when you looked at my mother and decided she wasn't worth your time. You made a choice when you treated her like she was beneath you. And now?" He glanced at the crowd watching, the employees speaking up, the cameras recording. "Now you're just mad that choice came back to bite you." Mark's face was beet red, his arrogance completely drained. He looked around, but there was no one left to back him up. And Shaq? Shaq wasn't done yet. Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out a second business card. This one he didn't hand to Mark. Instead, he turned and offered it to the young salesman who had first spoken up. The kid hesitated, then took it, reading the name printed in bold letters. His eyes widened. "You serious?" he breathed. Shaq grinned. "I'm always serious about good business." Mark watched in horror as the kid nodded slowly, then looked Mark dead in the eye before slipping the card into his pocket. Shaq clapped a heavy hand on the young man's shoulder, then turned back to Mark. "See, I told you earlier. I'm looking to buy a dealership." He gestured toward the employees still standing frozen. "And I think I just found some folks who deserve better management." Mark's entire body locked up. His worst nightmare was happening right in front of him. Shaq smiled, slow and satisfied. "So, Mark, you might want to go ahead and call your boss. Let him know there's going to be some changes coming." Mark stared in stunned silence, his mind racing, panicking. The cameras kept rolling. The employees stood taller now, emboldened. Shaq took one last look at Mark before slipping his sunglasses back on. Then, with a small smirk, he turned and walked away, leaving the once powerful manager standing in the wreckage of his own downfall. And just like that, the power had shifted. Mark Reynolds, the manager who had so confidently dismissed Lucille O'Neill, stood pale and visibly shaken. His carefully built empire of bias and control had collapsed around him, and Shaquille O'Neal was standing at the center of it all, holding the final card. Mark looked around desperately, but there was nowhere to turn. His employees had turned against him, the customers had witnessed his downfall, and Shaq? Shaq wasn't letting him off the hook. Then, before Mark could even attempt to salvage what was left, the sound of hurried footsteps filled the showroom. A group of sharply dressed executives pushed through the glass doors, their expressions a mix of urgency and damage control. Corporate had arrived. The moment the higher-ups entered, they immediately scanned the room, their polished appearances doing nothing to mask the panic in their eyes. These weren't car salesmen. They were decision-makers, the ones who truly ran the business, and they knew exactly why they were here. Shaq had gone viral. Within hours, the footage of Mark's treatment of Lucille had spread like wildfire. News outlets were already reaching out for statements, social media was ablaze with outrage, and people were calling for boycotts of Regency Motors. Mark saw them, his last hope for survival, and rushed forward, his voice frantic. "Mr. Calloway, Mr. Rourke, this is all a misunderstanding." The taller of the two executives, Gerald Calloway, barely spared him a glance. His eyes were locked onto Shaq, who stood tall, unshaken in the middle of the chaos. Calloway stepped forward and extended a nervous hand. "Mr. O'Neill, I'm Gerald Calloway, Regional Director of Regency Motors. We heard about the situation, and I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience or disrespect your mother experienced here." Shaq didn't shake his hand. He simply stared at him, letting the weight of the moment stretch. Calloway cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "We value all of our customers, and I assure you this does not reflect our company's—" Shaq finally spoke, his voice steady, unwavering. "Save it." Calloway froze mid-sentence. Shaq glanced around the showroom. "I don't need a scripted apology, and I don't need you to assure me of anything." His deep voice rolled through the space, making even the most seasoned executives shift in place. "I need action." The crowd, employees and customers alike, leaned in slightly, sensing something big was coming. Calloway exhaled sharply. "Of course, Mr. O'Neill. We are more than willing to take whatever steps are necessary to rectify this." Shaq cut him off. "Good. Then fire him." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Mark's face twisted in horror. Calloway hesitated. He turned to Mark, clearly calculating the PR damage in real time. Shaq crossed his arms. "You want to prove your company isn't built on discrimination? Then start by getting rid of the man who represents it." Mark spun around, desperation taking over. "You can't do this. I've been here for years." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "And how many people have you turned away in those years, Mark?" Mark's mouth snapped shut. Calloway exchanged a quick glance with his colleagues, then sighed. Effective immediately, Mark Reynolds is no longer employed with Regency Motors. The room erupted into whispers. Mark stumbled back as if he had been physically struck. His empire had officially crumbled. Shaq exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. One problem down. Now for the real move. He turned back to Calloway. That's not enough. Calloway blinked, confused. Excuse me? Shaq took a step forward, his presence dominating the room. This dealership isn't just broken because of one racist manager. It's broken because the system let him get away with it for so long. Firing him doesn't fix that. Calloway swallowed hard. What do you suggest then? Shaq pulled out his own business card and handed it over. The executive frowned as he read it. The silence stretched. Then, his eyes widened. Calloway looked up sharply. You want to buy the dealership? Shaq nodded. Another collective gasp. Mark let out a choked noise from the sidelines. This can't be happening. Shaq ignored him, his attention laser-focused on Calloway. You want to salvage your company's reputation? Then sell me this dealership. Right here, right now. Calloway stammered, completely caught off guard. Mr. O'Neill, this is a multi-million-dollar establishment and… Shaq raised a hand. I know exactly how much it's worth. I'll wire you the money today. Calloway's breathing grew unsteady. He turned to the other executives, who were whispering in urgent, hushed tones. The reality was sinking in fast. If they didn't take the deal, Shaq could ruin them. He had the influence, the resources, and, most importantly, the public on his side. Calloway exhaled sharply, shoulders dropping. We'll need to call corporate to finalize paperwork, but… He looked at Shaq with resignation. Consider it done. Shaq smirked. Good. Shaq turned to the employees, many of whom still looked shell-shocked. This place is under new management. His voice boomed through the space, snapping them to attention. One of the younger salesmen, the same one who had first spoken up against Mark, grinned. So, does that mean I still have a job? Shaq chuckled. Yeah. But from now on, we're doing things differently. He let his gaze sweep across the staff. No more turning customers away because they don't fit the image. No more profiling. No more making people feel like they're not good enough to be here. The employees nodded quickly, eager to align themselves with their new boss. Shaq turned to the receptionist. You good with that? She swallowed nervously, then gave a firm nod. Yes, sir. Shaq nodded back. Good. Then, he pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. Hey, Ma, he said, his tone lighter now, carrying something that had been missing all morning, satisfaction. You still want that SUV? There was a pause on the other end. Then, Lucille chuckled. Well, I was thinking about it. But now, I think I'd like to buy it from my son's dealership. Shaq grinned. I'll have it detailed for you before you get here. As the new owner of Regency Motors, Shaq walked toward the dealership entrance, where customers, employees, and even a few local news reporters had started to gather. He turned back once more, glancing at Mark, who still stood in stunned silence. Next time, Shaq said casually, maybe think twice before deciding who belongs in a place like this. Then, without another glance, he stepped outside, leaving behind a dealership forever changed. And Mark? Mark Reynolds was now just another cautionary tale. The heavy glass doors of Regency Motors swung open as Mark Reynolds stepped out for the last time. His polished shoes scuffed against the pavement, but the confident stride he once carried was now gone. His shoulders were hunched, his face pale, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For years he had been untouchable. He had built his career on power plays, deciding who was worth his time and who wasn't. But now he was the one being dismissed. Behind him, inside the dealership, the employees stood frozen for a brief moment, processing what had just happened. Then, a slow, quiet ripple of applause. It started with one of the younger salesmen, then another, until the entire showroom erupted into cheers. It wasn't just about Mark being fired. It was about what it meant. For years, they had watched him treat people unfairly, catering only to those who looked like the right kind of customer. They had stayed silent. But now the silence had broken. Mark shot a final, bitter glare toward the showroom, but no one rushed to his defense. No one called him back. He was officially alone. With one last look at the dealership he had once controlled, he turned and disappeared into the parking lot, his career nothing more than a cautionary tale. The dealership was still buzzing from the shift in power when the rumble of an engine outside caught everyone's attention. A sleek black SUV rolled into the parking lot. The door opened, and Lucille O'Neill stepped out. Unlike the first time she had walked through those doors, this time she wasn't just a customer. She was the reason everything had changed. Shaq stood near the entrance, arms crossed, grinning as he watched his mother step onto her new turf. Employees scrambled to open the door for her, their expressions completely different than before. Shaq held out his arms. "Ma." Lucille walked up, tilting her head slightly as she studied him. "So, you own a car dealership now?" Shaq smirked. "Something like that." Lucille sighed, but there was amusement in her eyes. "Baby, I just wanted a car. I didn't ask you to buy the whole building." Shaq shrugged. "Well, I don't do things halfway." The employees gathered around as Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out a key fob. "Here," he said, placing it gently in Lucille's hand. "Pick any car you want. It's yours." A few gasps echoed in the room. Lucille looked down at the key, then back at her son. "Shaquille," she started, her voice gentle. "I don't need a free car." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I know you don't need it, but I want you to have it. You walked in here yesterday and got disrespected. I want you to walk out today owning the place." Lucille smiled. A slow, knowing smile. She could have rubbed it in. She could have made a spectacle of it. But that wasn't her style. Instead, she turned to the employees, the same people who had stayed silent when Mark humiliated her. "You know," she said, her voice soft but clear, "people make mistakes." The employees shifted uncomfortably, knowing exactly what she meant. Lucille glanced around at them, her expression calm. But the real test of character isn't whether or not you make mistakes, it's whether or not you learn from them. A few of them nodded, looking down at their feet. Lucille smiled again, a warmth spreading through the room. It's never too late to treat people with kindness. Shaq watched as her words sank in. His mother had a way of saying something simple, but making it feel profound. Then she turned back to Shaq. "All right then," she said, tossing the key fob lightly in her palm. "I think I'll take a look around." The following week, things at Regency Motors changed. Shaq put new policies in place, ensuring that no customer, no matter what they looked like, no matter where they came from, would ever be turned away again. He brought in diversity training for the employees. But more than that, he made sure the dealership hired a more diverse team, bringing in salespeople who reflected the real world, not just one privileged version of it. The toxic culture Mark had built? Gone. And the best part? The customers noticed. People started coming in, drawn not just by the name attached to the business, but by the story behind it. One afternoon, as Shaq was leaving the dealership, he spotted the young salesman who had spoken up first that day. "Hey," Shaq called out. The guy turned, straightening up. "Yes, sir?" Shaq grinned, tossing him a small box. "You just got promoted." The kid's eyes widened. He opened the box, finding a gold nameplate inside. "Sales manager." The kid looked up, pure shock on his face. "Are you serious?" Shaq nodded. "You spoke up when no one else did. That's the kind of leadership this place needs." The young man grinned, his chest swelling with pride. "I won't let you down, sir." Shaq clapped him on the back. "I know you won't." And just like that, the dealership wasn't just a business anymore. It was a statement. A lesson in respect. The story didn't stay local for long. Within hours of the confrontation at the dealership, videos flooded social media. Shaq buys racist car dealership and fires manager on the spot. Shaquille O'Neal flips the script on discrimination, and the internet is cheering. # respect for Lucille trends nationwide. Millions watched the footage of Mark's downfall. The dealership's past treatment of customers came to light, forcing the entire company to make nationwide changes. By the end of the week, Regency Motors Corporate announced a full-scale diversity overhaul across all locations, not because they wanted to, because Shaq made them. That evening, back at Shaq's mansion, the TV flickered in the background. A news anchor was covering the story yet again, replaying clips of the dealership takeover. Shaq sat on the couch, his massive frame stretched out, flipping through his phone. Lucille sat beside him, a cup of tea in her hand. She watched the screen quietly for a moment, then shook her head. "All this over a car?" she murmured. Shaq smirked. "Nah, this was never about the car." Lucille glanced over at him, waiting. Shaq set his phone down, looking at her. "Ma, you always taught me to use my voice when something wasn't right. You always told me to stand up, not just for myself, but for other people." Lucille held his gaze, listening. Shaq exhaled. "You've always been my hero." He nodded toward the TV. "Now, the world knows why." Lucille smiled. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She reached over and patted his massive hand. "I'm proud of you, baby." Shaq swallowed, then grinned. "I know, Ma." Outside, the world was still talking, still celebrating what had happened. But in that moment, inside their home, it was just a mother and her son. And that was the real victory. Subscribe and share this story. Speak up when you see discrimination, and support businesses that treat everyone with dignity. Change doesn't happen on its own. It starts with us. Follow for more powerful stories, be part of the conversation, and let's build a world where respect isn't a privilege, it's a right.